We filmed this 10 years ago, and then the most recent edition of the Spotlight series was filmed in the same location, but now it's a gourmet ice cream sandwich shop.
Chris Ryan is a short-form documentary filmmaker. His company, Once Films, takes him all over the country, sometimes to places across the world. But St. Louis is where he calls home, and where he has a soft spot for genuine human storytelling. You've seen his work on Living St. Louis.
I make woodcuts about the downfall of society.
Something will get painted. I just don't know what.
Let's have a glass and celebrate, right? I got this great whiskey.
He's the man behind the lens of the STL.org Spotlight series. And while we know there are many things about St. Louis that need improvement, I sat down with Chris Ryan to talk about why he believes in St. Louis and why his passion project is to tell the stories about what make it special. Its people. And you are a St. Louisan.
Yes.
Through and through, but you came via somewhere else.
Yeah, I feel like while I am a transplant, I'm also 100% STL made. I was a military kid, and so I moved around a fair amount. I had the luxury of seeing different cultures and meeting lots of different people.
Because you talk about being sort of exploring St. Louis and meeting the people and finding all the things that are special. And I think that St. Louisans love St. Louis. That's why those of us that grew up here, we're raising our kids here, we're making our lives here. But at the same time, we have an inferiority complex. That's not new. We talk about that quite often. Somebody from Greater St. Louis Inc. said that when they did a survey to find out outside of St. Louis what people thought of St. Louis, they either didn't know anything about it or they had negative impressions of it because people that live there gave them that impression.
Right. Not that I have any necessarily power to do so, but it is really important that we have and start to project a real positive sensibility of ourselves. I mean, it's civic self-esteem. I mean, you're not going to change anybody's mind. I can't go person to person and say, feel better about St. Louis and say good things. But, there is a growing group of people that have become real St. Louis boosters, and those are my people.
I feel like there's this gap, and maybe it's because of what I see on social media.
Yeah.
And I think because everybody's pulling out their phones, that there's just so much more that people know.
Yeah.
That everything seems like it's all going downhill.
Sure.
And so you've got the people that are the boosters, and then you have the people that are well, that's typical, of course this is happening, crime,
right,
education, all of those things need to be addressed, and there are issues. But there's either you can't say anything nice, or you sound like you're drinking too much of the Kool-Aid.
For sure. And there is an advantage of hardly ever being on social media, that I get to sort of exist in my own echo chamber and not worry about it too much. But it's a whole lot easier to be a cynic than it is to be an optimist. And, I think for a really long time, we as Americans have enjoyed being contrarian. And so anytime there's good news, there's always somebody right there to tell you all the bad things. Those exist, of course, right? It would be a really boring world if it was binary, just like everything was good. Like, we know it's a complex situation. But I also feel like my role in the conversation isn't to try to unpack that complexity. It's to just try to tip the scale. And so a lot of the stories I'm involved in telling, are generally positive and optimistic, because I feel like that's part of the scale that just needs that extra tipping, that needs that little bit of help.
Well, explain to me, using your platform, you're not telling people St. Louis is great.
Right, absolutely.
You're using your skill and your talent and the stories of people to create a different narrative and picture. So explain to me what that is.
For sure. I think there's two ways to look at it. One is that the work I do didn't start out as being pro St. Louis. Like that wasn't really the intention to come out and say, I'm going to tell these stories about St. Louis and then people are going to love them or they're going to love St. Louis more. You know, really what it started with for me was being that transplant and finding, like just discovering the city and finding really interesting people and just things I like to visit and people I love to talk to. And obviously a natural extension of the work I do was to say, can I film some of this? You know, can I hang out with you for a few days or a couple of hours? Can I talk to you on camera maybe about the kind of work and your mentality and thinking process about your work? The other conversation you could have is, you know, the work as it exists today. I think coming at it and just trying to be overtly pro St. Louis doesn't really tell the story, right? Like, because the question should always be, just like a 5-year-old, why? 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 And the why for me are the people. You know, the people make St. Louis doesn't make people. So if we start with St. Louis and we try to find all the reasons it's great, you know, if we just look at it and say, well, who's here? If I think it's great, why do I think it's great? And then go to like the base level of that conversation and lift that story up from the bottom instead of trying to pull it up by the handle.
For Living St. Louis, I'm Anne Marie Berger.